Hello. On behalf of the University of the West and our fellow co-sponsor, Shilai Temple, I would like to welcome you to the Spring 2015 lecture series. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us in the digital realm this evening. Tonight is the first talk in a series that will explore Buddhism's place in our world today and offer us a glimpse into Buddhism's future. My name is Jamie Womura, and I'm Chair and Associate Professor of Religious Studies at University of the West. And it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Louis Lancaster. Dr. Lancaster is Professor Emeritus and former President of the University of the West. He is also Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley, where he taught for 33 years and served as the Chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature. Prolific, Dr. Lancaster has authored over 55 books, articles, and reviews that have had a formative influence on the field of Buddhist studies. A true pathfinder, Dr. Lancaster's innovative work and perspective blaze a trail as he shifts our understanding of Buddhism's roots and transmission. An engaged scholar, he also consults and attends meetings with Buddhist groups and organizations around the world. Given the breadth and depth of his understanding, the broad scope that one would need to peer into Buddhism's future, I can think of no one better equipped to lead us into Buddhism in the 21st century except for Dr. Louis Lancaster.
Thank you very much, Jane. Not sure I deserve all that. I'm going to talk to you tonight about something that's been occupying my thinking for some time, and that is the recognition that the Buddhist tradition ebbs and flows. There are times when it thrives in places, and then there are times when it can ebb in those places and even disappear. And sometimes it reappears. And I've been trying to figure out what is it in the Buddhist tradition that allows it to have and to be so influenced by something other than itself that it can ebb and flow around the world as it has done. And this ebbing and flowing was at no time more pronounced than in the 20th century. We have just seen a century in which Buddhism ebbed during the first 3/4 of the century and then flowed for the last quarter. So I've been trying to look at that, and if you don't mind, I will first take you back in history just a little bit and get a running start up to the 20th century, because as always, nothing starts in the 20th century. Everything that's in the 20th century, as the Buddhists have taught us, has a preceding moment, which has a preceding moment, which has a preceding moment. So let's get underway. I have given the name of the Great Circle to this part of the Eurasian landmass where Buddhism has found its homeland. And that great circle of Buddhism is one that our history constantly refers us to. The way that I came to the Great Circle was through the travels of the Korean pilgrim Wonhyo. Wonhyo knew enough about the Great Circle that he went down to the sea and knew that he could go from Korea to India in the end of the 8th century. And on his way back, he went through Central Asia. He almost completed the circle, except he never went back home to Korea. He stayed and passed away in China. But he left a diary, and that diary has allowed us to really see what was the case in very ancient times, really, for people who knew about the Great Circle and could walk it in those days. The Great Circle today is of great interest. That's because people now are drawing maps of the Great Circle because it contains more than 50% of the world's population. This is the most heavily populated area in the world. So that whatever happens to Buddhism happens in a populated area. So that the numbers and the issues which are presented to Buddhism have to do with this rapid growth of population. That means urbanization. It means all the issues that arise from really very intense occupation. The first ebb and flow of Buddhism happened in its own country. It's very well stated in almost every book. Buddhism thrived in India after the time of the Buddha, up through time of Ashoka, spread wide and went from India over to Sri Lanka. And it was a glorious time for the Buddhist tradition. And then it ebbed. When it ebbed, it didn't so much disappear as it became invisible. It was all the practices that it had were somehow seen within the Brahmanic tradition. But Buddhism in India was always an outsider. The Brahmanic tradition was agrarian. It was based on really a kind of feudal farmland culture in which the caste system was used to maintain the control of the land and the products that came from the farming. Buddhism, on the other hand, looked on that and I think could not have survived by becoming part of that agrarian movement. There was no place for Buddhism in that agrarian tradition. So instead, Buddhism became a pro-trade, non-agricultural, open society of merchants. And without that open society of merchants, I do not think it could have thrived as it did. So that when we look at the difference in India as to why Buddhism ebbed and flowed, it flowed as long as there was trade, as long as the open society produced great results. The Buddhists became the bankers. They became the people at the seaports. They were in control of the monetary and the commercial ventures that were going on in India. And as long as that was thriving, Buddhism thrived. When that began to falter, and it began to falter because Eurasia underwent an enormous change. At both ends of Eurasia were great empires, the Romans and the Han. As long as the Romans and the Han were helping to drive this great trade between both sides of that great landmass, there was exactly the situation which Buddhism needed for its survival. When the Roman Empire fell and the Han Empire fell, that whole system began to crumble. And with the crumbling of both the Romans and the Han, Buddhism underwent one of its ebbing. It began to ebb. But before it ebbed, it had built some wonderful things. Those merchants supported Buddhism in very good terms. Caves built along the trade routes where the caravans went. Caves became gorgeous galleries of art. The structures that were built along those routes, huge, magnificent. There was a lot of money. That's because the Buddhists were tied to the group that had money, that dealt in money and not land. They dealt in money and trade, not land and caste. There was a great difference between them and the rest of the world around them, and Buddhism thrived under that. The Roman Empire began to fail. And there's no better way to see how well an empire does than to look at its coinage. The golden coins that we find in southern India by the thousands, when the trade was really very active. Those golden coins were mainly coins from periods like from Augustus. But by the time of Nero in Rome, the coinage was so debased that it was almost totally devoid of any silver, whatever, or any gold. It was base metals. And when a country has to produce coinage that's base metals, in archaeology, you know it's in trouble. So we can track the decline of this trade which had been built with the Han and the Romans by looking at the coins. That alone tells us a great deal. So in India, Buddhism began to just ebb away. The only place where it remained at all active in India was with the Pala dynasty. That's the purple up there at the Bay of Bengal. The Pala dynasty was still deeply involved in the trade that went throughout Southeast Asia. And because the Palas were still very much engaged in trading and activities of that sort, I believe that's the reason that Buddhism found its last great support in India among the Pala kings and the Pala dynasty. After the Romans and the Han began to crumble, the trading began to change its focus, and it moved over to the east coast rather than the west coast. And it spread throughout Southeast Asia and into the islands of Indonesia. And that spread of Buddhism in that direction, this became, in one way, after the time of the Han, this Srivijaya kingdom was the most active trading area of the world, probably. This was one of the richest places on earth when that was really fully going. And so when you travel to Java and you see Borobudur and you see this fantastic monument to Buddhism, perhaps the largest Buddhist building ever built, it was done by the Srivijaya. It was done by these people who had maintained a very active trading program and industry and culture after parts of the Indian ports had become very much less oriented toward the trade, and trade had become localized rather than international. So when we see the great monuments in Sumatra, and we realize that Sumatra was the center for the study of Tantric Buddhism, and that Atisha of Tibet went to Sumatra to be trained in Buddhism, and that he took this form of Sumatran Buddhism and spread it to Tibet. That's an indication of the great power of the Srivijaya and how much it was involved. Atisha came out through the area where the Pala dynasty meets the Ganges. And that kind of trade activity tells us a lot about how Tibetan Buddhism developed as well as our other. With the fall of the Srivijaya, Buddhism goes into an ebb, a big ebb this time. The ebb was that everywhere the Islamic merchants took over the trade, Buddhism disappears. As those Nabataean merchants took over the ports of India, of Sumatra, of Java, Malaysia, in all of those places, Buddhism no longer had a support system. And with the lack of that support system, these places and the vacuum created by the decline of the Srivijaya trading kingdom, Buddhism ebbed right out of sight. I say this because I feel that it's really important for us in this day and age, where we have so much negative information about Islam. And we are told often in our books that Islam conquered, Islam destroyed by armies, Islam invaded. That the spread of Islam into the place today where it has the most members of all places, which is Indonesia. There are more Muslims in Indonesia than all of the Middle East. That this place didn't get it by war. Islam did not come, it came as a peaceful tradition. It came as trade. And that trading community, however, had their own religion. And that religion became the dominant religion because Islam in the seaports was just like Buddhism had been in the past. It depended on those merchants to support it, and they did. The next great ebb for Buddhism was the European colonial expansion. It was a time when the Buddhists were once again faced with a shadow that fell across their system. The colonial opposition first came from Portugal. It was a time when the Pope had enough power to say to the ruling families of Europe, I'm going to tell you where you get to be missionaries. Portugal, you get Asia. Spain, of course, threw a fit and said, you can't do that. You can't let those Portuguese have the whole world. And so finally they opened up to the Spanish, and of course that's why you have the Philippines as they are today. That the Pope reversed it and said, okay, the Spanish can go, but the Portuguese came first. So St. Francis Xavier was a great figure in all of this. He had a lot of trouble though. He was faced with the fact that how do you just walk into cultures and suddenly missionize them and convert them to something that's totally different than what they had? So he started to translate the Bible into Chinese, and they had the same problem that we all have when we try to translate the Buddhist text into English. What equivalents do you use? We have no words for those Sanskrit terms. We have no English word for nirvana. We have no English word specifically for samadhi. We don't have these words, so what do? We borrow. So he started borrowing Buddhist terms for the Bible. And the Buddhists now are faced with a whole new situation. How can they deal with the fact that here is an outside power which is coming into their cultures and is going to compete with them in a very major way? It kind of backfired on poor St. Xavier, because the Chinese began to read his translation of the Bible and they said, ah, a new Buddhist school has arrived. And when he realized that they thought it was a Buddhist group, he went back and tried to redo the translation of the Bible and remove all those Buddhist terms because he realized he'd made a big mistake. When he got to Japan, he was Catholic. He hated Martin Luther because Martin Luther was his competitor back home. And Martin Luther said, it's faith, not works, that will get you to heaven. Works are monastics, works are good works, but it's only faith. So he got to Japan, he met the Jodo Shinshu group, and they said, you have only one thing to depend upon, which is the vow of Amitabha. You must have faith in Amitabha. You cannot work your way into salvation anymore because we live in the bad Dharma age. So he wrote back to Rome and said, you can't believe that those Lutherans have been here. They have converted these Japanese to Lutheranism, and now I'm faced with it here as well as at home. He didn't know history. He didn't know where he was in many ways, but he was very influential. A different situation existed with Matteo Ricci, who went later. Matteo Ricci was a very educated person, and he learned Chinese perfectly. He spoke, he wrote, and at first he dressed as a Buddhist monk. But then he realized that that was all Xavier had found out. Trying to show yourself to the locals in something they understood as a Buddhist was not a really good way to do it. So he changed. He took off his monk's robes and he put on the robes of a Confucian scholar. And thereafter he presented himself to the Chinese as a scholar, as a Confucian. And he believed very, and in some ways rightly, that the Confucian tradition and Christianity had more chance of being put together than any other form of the culture that he was faced with in China. He became and set in place something which the Buddhists are still struggling with. He came with the concept that he was bringing a scientific view of the world. He brought with him geometry, astronomy, map making. He came with all of these, and he put forward the idea that Christianity was a way, in a sense, to reach modernity as we know it today in terms of that term. It's ironic because he was using the scientific idea from the Enlightenment in Europe, whereas the Enlightenment people were at daggers with the Christians in Europe. They believed that the church held back science in Europe. So most of the European scholars were very opposed to the church. But when you went to China, suddenly the church is the way in which you can get all the good science and everything that's good from the Europeans. So Buddhism now is faced with a group that says, we can teach you things that you don't know. We can teach you things that will give you great benefit. And so he began, I think, to recognize, and that's what happened with most of the conflict between, or the competition between Buddhism and Christianity in Asia, was the idea that you have medicine and education with Christianity. And therefore you build colleges, you build universities, you build medical facilities, you introduce all of this, and that's the way in which you can win the allegiance. And it worked in quite large numbers, for large numbers of people. So for example, for years in Taiwan, if you weren't a Christian, you could never be elected to a high political office. That's finally changed, but for a long time, this idea which is set in motion by Ricci, that shadow still was felt, and it's still felt often in Hong Kong. I feel it very often when I teach classes in Hong Kong. There are many of the older students who come to my class who grew up under this idea of Christianity is science and advanced medicine, and it's not superstition, etc. So he did a good job. He was very sharp. In the 20th century, the colonial issues became very strong. And the band that you see, you can see it on, I don't know if the people can see it, that band across just north of the equator was the focus of colonial activity from Europe. That was one of the major places that they took over the nations in that band. And that was the old band of trade for the Buddhist. And now it is the focus of colonial activity. So Buddhism faced the colonials, and it was a very hard time for them. In places like Sri Lanka, the Buddhists were faced with the fact that the colonials who came into Sri Lanka were converting people to Christianity as almost a political move. And it was The same in India. The Hindus were being faced with the fact that people were being converted to Christianity. And sometimes they would work hard and reconvert them. So there was a great struggle that was part of that colonial issue. Perhaps no group challenged the Buddhists as much as did the Protestant missions, particularly in China. Thousands of Protestant missionaries flooded to Asia and particularly to China. China was the favorite mission site. And they not only were along the seacoast, but they had the inland China mission, and that went into villages and small places all through China. And those activities still reflect in how the Buddhists were faced in the 20th century with something which they were hardly equipped to answer, because nobody had ever questioned them in quite the way this group did. And this group came with money, they came with medicine, they came with a lot that they could offer, and they came with bearing gifts. And they made great strides. So when you look at the world, and you look at the Great Circle, this map shows China as nothing. It's white, but that's not part of it, right? I mean, it's blue. It's really blue. The Buddhists were always constantly faced with issues of things that caused them to ebb and things which allowed them to flow. The next great stage for Buddhism, and it faced its greatest enemy and its greatest challenge in some ways from Russia. Russia's Tsar had expanded his kingdom all the way to the Pacific. And the Tsarist leaders that were spread across Russia came in contact, of course, with the people along the Mongolian border who were Buddhist. And they could, at times, they didn't know quite what to do with the Buddhist. The situation was that the Manchu dynasty had created a situation in not only East Asia, but in Central Asia, where people were very restive under the Manchus. They were not was not happiness by any means. But they seemed so powerful, who do you turn to? The idea began to grow that there was a place to the north, which was Shambhala. And that Shambhala and Maitreya were going to come and help rescue the whole of this inner Asia from the Manchus. You would think that wouldn't be, that sounds so far out, don't you think? But the 13th Dalai Lama was faced with this. He fled from Tibet. The 14th Dalai Lama that we have today was not the first Dalai Lama to have to flee. 13th also fled to Mongolia. His main advisor became very pro-Russian. And he told him that he believed that the Tsar was a reincarnate bodhisattva. And that the only solution was the red Shambhala. And the red Shambhala was to the north. And he tried to make arrangements between the Tsar and the 13th Dalai Lama, who was faced with trying to figure out how in the world to handle a world which was flying out of control from the perspective of people in Central Asia, Inner Asia. Who's going to come out on top? You don't know. Is it the Chinese? Is it the Russians? Is it the British? Is it India? They were all in there. And then some people were coming along with a very strange new flag saying they were from the United States. And then Is it the United States that's going to come and conquer us? Everybody was in complete upheaval over this. In this kind of wild and woolly environment came strange people who came along and said, in essence, we're your solution. Here I am. One of them was someone that we look back and look at some of the descriptions and really believe that he was not mentally all there, but he was a very powerful man, Baron Ungern. He came and established himself as really the ruler over large parts of Inner Asia for a short period of time. And in Siberia, he had done such terrible things that the Mongols called him Mahakala. In particular, he had killed thousands of Jews. The Mongols knew the Jewish community as the Black Russians. There were many Jewish merchants and others in Siberia, and they traded with the Mongols. And there had never been any trouble. They couldn't understand what this man was doing, why he was out there killing all of these people and telling them, it is necessary to purify the world, I have to do this. And so they decided anybody who kills like this has got to be Mahakala. We're in some period of time. Fortunately, he didn't last very long. A new face of this kind of environment which the Buddhists were facing in Inner Asia, and that is a man named Rorik decided that he and his wife were going to set up an Inner Asian kingdom. And he had been influenced by Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, and his wife had visions, and relying on her visions, they set forth to have a utopia in Inner Asia. Henry Wallace, who was Vice President of the United States, at the time was also Secretary of Agriculture. While he was Secretary of Agriculture, became very involved with Rorik, as did President Roosevelt, through Wallace. And it took them a little bit of time to realize that they had hooked their wagon to the wrong star, that Rorik was a wild card. They better, and Roosevelt withdrew his interest. But when Henry Wallace ran for president, one of the things that defeated him were the so-called Guru letters, the letters which he had written to Rorik, which were an indication of an involvement in this idea of somehow a utopian vision of an empire set up in Inner Asia that would be pure, religious, ethical, etc. He was a great artist, by the way, and his paintings, I show everyone here, his paintings helped finance what he did. Just recently, one of them went on sale at Sotheby's and got over $500,000. Well, this idea of the Red Shambhala, of these ideas of we're going to somehow be saved from outside. The Mongols had a great oracle, and he told the Mongols, the salvation of Mongolia is going to come from outside. And so the Soviets, who were sending their representatives into that part of the world, built on this and said, yes, it's true. We are your salvation. You must rely on us, and we can save you from the issues that are coming. The Marxist tradition not only spread into Mongolia, but it spread through China, through Korea. It went to Vietnam, to Laos. And the spread of that communist regime throughout Inner Asia put an end to all of these building of empires, and yet its very rhetoric was based on that same rhetoric that had been used for the Red Shambhala. When the Chinese came into Tibet in the mid of the 20th century, I wish I could get a copy of it. I saw it once, a propaganda film which they produced to be shown in villages in Tibet. It was a wonderful propaganda film. And it said, there is salvation coming for you. You will know them by the red star. And that red star is, these are Maitreya's forces that are coming to establish a new Shambhala. They picked up on that old idea that had been current there in Inner Asia for a long time. And the Tibetans were longing for this. And they still have one of their major prayers is, Maitreya, don't wait, come now. We need you now. Don't wait for eons before you come to this earth. Well, the Marxist tradition, of course, was part of European Enlightenment, and that Enlightenment said religion is something that holds people back. It is something which you don't want. You've got to get rid of it. And Buddhism now is being totally devastated in that region. The place that suffered probably the most is Mongolia. In 1938, thousands of lamas were killed by the new communist government that had been set up in Mongolia. And it's always sad because anytime you read about people from Mongolia, how often you see the death date is 1938. And they didn't all die in 1938 from natural causes. So that this attack from communism was one of the most severe tests that Buddhism had ever faced. It was total. The Buryats, they were on the front line, in a sense, of this coming from the Soviets into the Chinese regions. The Buryats were stripped of their monasteries. They suffered mightily during this whole period. When they finally, the USSR was over, one of the first things they did was to rename the National Academy of Science the National Academy of Science and Buddhist Studies. It was a protest against what they had just gone through. Tuva was the same. The Tuva tradition was put under the same restrictions. All of these areas were restricted. When the USSR ended, and even before, Buddhism was allowed to return to these places and people flocked back to it. So that Buddhism, which had ebbed with the communist thing, with the fall of the USSR, began to flow as never before. So even in almost a single stroke, tens of thousands of people would return to Buddhism because it was permitted that day. That kind of growth was spectacular in terms of people flooding back into the Buddhist tradition. Kalmykia is those people, you just wonder how they have held together. They moved them all. Can you imagine? You move a whole nation full of people from one place to another place to another place, and finally settled them all in basically Europe, just north of the Caspian Sea. Kalmykia had been a very major Buddhist group, and those Kalmykian people today are trying to figure out how in the world to reestablish their Buddhism. They are returning to it, but they've lost so many of generations of leadership. How do you overcome this so that the flow of Buddhism back to Kalmykia has been a slow process, and they continue to ask for help to figure out how to educate and how to bring young people back into it and how to overcome these years of being repressed and suppressed by this. One of their great leaders came to New Jersey, and he was there by the Tolstoy Foundation, supported him. He formed a place just north of Philadelphia, which is Freewood Acres, and it is in that place that some of our great Buddhist scholars first came in contact with Buddhism from a Kalmykian, that is Robert Thurman and Jeffrey Hopkins. People like this first came in contact with the Buddhist tradition through this displaced Buddhism, the diaspora of inner Asian Buddhism, which we've seen in the 20th century. Chitta's saying people there had struggled mightily. The role of shamanism there is more powerful than Buddhism in many ways, but they still have been coming back, and they've rebuilt a new temple for themselves. So Buddhism is on the flow once again in all of these states that line the Mongolian border. Mongolia itself, as I said, suffered mightily. In 1920, according to the census, there were more than 100,000 monks and 3,000 monasteries in Mongolia. And in 1940, they could only find 100. That kind of suppression and that kind of ebb of Buddhism in Mongolia is what I'm talking about in terms of ebb and flow. So now when you try to flow back, as it's now currently underway, and you start with only 100 for the whole country, you can see that the flow back that Buddhism faces is as much a challenge as anything that they've had. So they've had to figure out how do we do it, and what is the way in which we train our people, because we don't have leaders to do it. So that the flow of Buddhism, particularly in Inner Asia, was really strongly cut away by this. Mongolia, however, is a young country. You can look at the map of how many people are young at the bottom of those. That's a demographic. You can see that age 2, 10, 15, that they are a young nation. So that how a nation revives and how Buddhism flows again often depends on demographics. And so the question of Mongolia is how they will train and work with this new generation which comes on. So the current communist countries in Asia have changed, but the role of Buddhism in those countries has also shifted dramatically. Buddhism is extremely active in Vietnam, again. It is growing mightily in China. The only place that it still is completely suppressed practically is North Korea. Otherwise, the revival of Buddhism, even in communist countries, where basically you would think they would oppose it, it is not the case. I think that the Chinese government can recognize that the Buddhist tradition is probably much better for them than the dominance of either Christianity or Islam. And that's why they give support. And I think that's somewhat true for the Vietnamese as well. So now you see so many people at Buddhist events in China compared to the Cultural Revolution, where they were burning the altars, they were destroying the books, they were making factories in monasteries. The whole issue of trying to destroy the old culture that went on during that time when Buddhism was ebbing. Now it's on the flow again, and we're all interested to see where it's going to go. In the West, this ebb and flow began to show up in the United States and Europe. Buddhism began to flow. The Beat generation after World War II, this is a generation that said, what we've been through in World War II has beaten us to the ground. We are beat. We are defeated. We just are we've had so much trouble. So the Beat generation began to turn to Buddhism as part of a way to deal with being beat. And while they weren't that large in number, they were very influential. And the books they produced and the poems and the other cultural issues which they did really spread and made a great difference. The cultural alternative issue came with the Vietnamese War. And many people chose Buddhism as a cultural alternative to what they saw as a bankrupt policy of their own country. And the fact that young men were being taken to fight in a war they didn't want to go to, a war they didn't believe in anymore. And the issue of that in the country rising up in large demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people protesting it. During that period of time, Buddhism became an alternative for many people. It was a cultural alternative. So what we're seeing with Buddhism is that as it rises and falls, and it does, as you can see what I've been saying, it comes and goes. And it's very important to understand that Buddhism does that. So that people who believe that you only have a religion which constantly grows, and this is certainly the case for both Christianity and Islam, it is the religion triumphant which is the valid one. And triumphant means it always grows, and it never recedes. And of course, throughout history, it doesn't really work that way for any religion. They all have to face ebbs and flows. So what was there about the present in the 20th century which brought this flow to the West? It was two things. One was, of course, as a cultural alternative. The other was trade. Globalization had set in after World War II. Globalization was reaching its height in the 20th century, and along with globalization came global trade. And with global trade came the Buddhist. There's nothing which the Buddhist can thrive in better than global trade. So that you have in Europe today large groups. They're from Japan, they're from Vietnam, they're from China, they're from Thailand, and they are all there primarily because they are supported by people who have immigrated. And those immigrants are the supporters for this new flow of Buddhism which we find. For a lot of the people who are attracted to it outside of the immigrant groups, it is, as I said, a kind of cultural alternative which meets their needs, and they like it, and they're going to make use of it. Even in South America, the diaspora, particularly from Taiwan and from China, has brought Buddhism into areas of South America, and they have very large Buddhist activities in many of the countries, particularly in Brazil and Argentina and Chile and Peru. In Africa, I love it that Liberia made a stamp. Buddhism is on the flow when you get on the stamps. Oran Shan has built the equivalent of Shilai Temple in South Africa, where they have their training school. Other Buddhist groups are active in Africa, and recently at the United Nations Day of Vesak last year in Hanoi, Nigeria sent one of their kings, that is a tribal king, who announced to the group that he had converted to Buddhism and had asked his whole kingdom in Nigeria to convert to Buddhism. Australia, Buddhism is one of the fastest growing religions in Australia, not only among the immigrants, but among the native Australians, Euro-Australians as well. Nantian, which you see here, is our sister campus now in Australia, in Wollongong, and they're just going to have the big opening of their fantastic new campus building, which I think is one of the most interesting campus buildings I've ever seen. It is worth going there just to see. It really is. They're expecting 40 to 50,000 people to come to the opening when it's open. And our president here at U.S. will go to represent us at that event. President Morgan will be there. The ebb and the flow. The flow of Buddhism has been such that today there are more Chinese Buddhists than all other Buddhists combined. Buddhism is a Chinese religion in so many ways. And that is a statistic which I don't think is going to change just because of the demographics. When you have 1 billion, 300 million, you can do it. You really can. The spread of Buddhism, as I said, in this is partly because of the diaspora. The Chinese diaspora, as you can see from this map, and the other is the Indian diaspora. Here are the two largest populations in the world. India is the largest nation now, population-wise. China is second. The Indian and the Chinese merchants and people are spreading out around the world in a diaspora, and it's among the Chinese diaspora that part of the Buddhist flow is now taking place. So for the first time since the fall of the Srivijaya and the ascendancy of Islamic traders in Sumatra, there are now places in Sumatra where Buddhism is the dominant religion in a nation which is dominantly Islamic. And of course, they're all Chinese. That growth of the diaspora that we see here has been felt in Australia. You can see in Peru. This map doesn't show it, but there are part of it is, as I've said, Brazil and Chile. They also are part of it, and certainly the United States. The very fact that we're sitting in this building here on this campus is part of the Chinese diaspora. We are part of the flow that has occurred because the merchants and the business people have come here from particularly Taiwan, and in that diaspora have brought with them support for the Buddhist tradition, which was never present before. And it is making an enormous difference in the world. And this university that we are part of is a part of that growth and that flow of Buddhism today. At the same time, there's an interesting thing happening in the religious world. And the question is, will it cause an ebb? And the big thing that's happening is that it's not that the other religions are going to be the great challenge. It's that none of the above will be the challenge. More and more people say, I don't belong to anything. I am not a member of any religious tradition. And that growth of none of the above, as you can see, for example, in Australia, you can see that it's growing and becoming a really major part of the tradition. So the question for Buddhism is going to be, how do you answer that? Is that going to be an ebb, or is there a role for Buddhism to play with that group that says none of the above? When we look at the percentage who state that they are part of religion, you can see that those who say no religion, look at the younger people on that chart. If you get up to people my age, everybody says, yes, I'm religious. The more you go back, the larger the number of people who say, I'm nothing. Now, of course, I don't know what a 10-year-old says. I don't have a religion. I'll leave that to you. But it's, in a sense, it's probably true that a lot of children, because their parents are of the age that you see of the largest group of people who say, I have no religion, their children will not be being trained in a religion either. So that there is going to be a big issue for the world to figure out, what does this mean? And will this, it's not just Buddhism that faces this challenge. I think Islam is going to face it in a very major way. That there will be, I think, a reaction by a lot of the younger people who are educated and want to go ahead with their life. And when that begins, that ebb begins to come in any tradition, it's almost, it's like a trend which you can't control, because it is what I call a mega trend of demographics. And when suddenly you've got a mega trend of demographics where, for example, tomorrow I'm going to talk about the fact that one of the problems about recruiting monks and nuns in a lot of places is the demographics. There aren't enough young people anymore. You've got to go to places where there are young people to find people to join the monastic group. So that Buddhism will face this as a new challenge. The ebbs and the flows keep coming. They're never going to go away. We're going to have to face them. So if you look at this issue, you can see we men are less religious than the women. Surprise, surprise. I'm sure you never thought that that was the case. Maps that are beginning to show where are people the most religious and where are they the least. And it's certainly from this they're indicating that it's Africa and it's Southeast Asia, and it's that band that we saw, the colonial band, is still the place where people are the most religious. So Buddhism is still a part of the area where people mark themselves as, yes, I am a religious person. So it is not as if Buddhism faces this challenge perhaps so much as Christianity faces it, because Christianity is declining so rapidly in Europe and Russia. So Buddhism today, as I said, it's Chinese. This is a map of one of my projects where we geo-registered Buddhist monasteries of China. We tried to do close to 28,000 of the major ones. We don't know how to study the new Buddhism. I hate it when somebody goes to China and spends a week and comes back and writes an article about Buddhism in China. I mean, tourist impressions are perhaps valid, but we don't know what to make of them. China is huge, the world is huge, the world of Buddhism is huge. Everywhere we look, we see issues which have to be addressed. We need to figure out how we can put all of that data together to make some sense and some way to look at the future. So what I've said to you tonight is Buddhism throughout its history has ebbed and flowed. It's nothing new. Even in China, they used to have persecutions which would try to close down all the monasteries in the 5th century, in the 7th, in the 8th. They had all of these issues for a very long time. In Japan, the Shinto revival in 1868 was a kind of ebb of Buddhism even in Japan. For Korea, the Korean young rulers turned to the Neo-Confucians of the Sung dynasty and rejected Buddhism and put Buddhism under suppression in Korea from the 14th, 15th centuries until the 20th century. So Buddhism faces these all the time. And then what makes it ebb and what makes it flow is, I think, something which we as scholars of Buddhism need to be very alert to. And we cannot find the solutions always just within Buddhism itself. The solution to that question has to be determined on the context in which we look at the Buddhist tradition within its environments. And if we don't do that, I think we can play a kind of game about Buddhism, but I doubt that what we say is much more than a dice throw. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. We have no real structure to try to determine. And that's why I look to demographics, I look to models of trade, I look to the issues of the contextualization of politics. All of those are crucial to our understanding of Buddhism as we face it in this century. Thank you very much.